In the black pine-choked valleys of the Black Forest, tucked far away from the blinding light pollution of the 21st century, lay the village of Oakhaven. It was a place where progress arrived late, if it arrived at all, and where time was measured not in seconds but in seasons. The cobblestone streets were narrow and wound like ancient roots, demanding reverence from any vehicle brave enough to navigate them. It was here in the heart of Oakhaven, where the world felt oldest and quietest, that Herr Weber operated his clock repair shop. The shop itself was an institution, tucked behind a facade of dark oak and thick, uneven glass panes that blurred the world outside into a soft, impressionist painting. Herr Weber did not just fix clocks, he curated them. He was a master of the gear, the spring, and the pendulum. His hands, though map-marked with age and covered in a fine dust of brass, possessed a terrifying precision, able to tease life back into mechanisms that had been silent for a century. He knew the peculiar heartbeat of every timepiece in his sanctuary, the deep thrum of the grandfather clocks, the energetic click-clack of the mantel clocks, and the chaotic chorus of dozens of small bird clocks all singing their disjointed songs. To the villagers, Herr Weber was a fixture, as essential as the church bell. But many also whispered that he was lonely, living only with the ghosts of hours past. His world was composed entirely of sound, a constant, comforting matrix of ticking that defined his existence, allowing him to sleep peacefully, enveloped by the rhythmic safety of 1,000 tiny mechanical hearts. He required no radio, no conversation, only the synchronized pulse of his shop. One December night, the atmosphere in Oakhaven changed. A winter storm, slow and methodical, began to drape the village in heavy, wet snow, muffling all sound beyond the shop's thick walls. The street lamps, glowing like distant captured stars, struggled against the onslaught. By 11:30 p.m., the shop was closed, and Herr Weber, after carefully locking the heavy oak front door, ascended the creaking spiral stairs to his modest living quarters above. The ticking from below was muffled but still present, a faithful heartbeat beneath his feet. He began his nightly routine, a quiet ritual performed in the golden light of a single kerosene lamp, avoiding the sterile buzz of electricity. He filled his kettle, set it on the stove, and walked to the street-facing window to pull the heavy velvet curtains, sealing his warm world against the encroaching frost. It was a cold night, the kind that steals your breath and leaves it hanging in the air. Yet as his hand gripped the thick, dark red fabric, he paused. The snow below was coming down hard, making a blur of the street lamp across the narrow cobblestone road, and standing directly under that lamp, perfectly illuminated against the chaotic white swirl, was a figure. It was a young woman. She wore no winter coat, no scarf, only a dark, thin dress that looked utterly inadequate for the freezing temperature. Her hair, unraveled and dark, framed a pale face turned directly upward, staring with focused intensity not at the shop door, but specifically at his window. She did not move. She did not shiver. The snow piled upon her shoulders and in her hair unignored. A profound sense of wrongness, cold and sharp, cut through Herr Weber's usual detached calm. Was she a traveler? Did she need shelter? Perhaps her car had broken down and she was in shock. In Oakhaven, you did not ignore someone in the snow. Pity wrestling with a primal, instinctual dread, Herr Weber did something he never did. He unlatched the heavy brass mechanism of his window and pushed the wooden frame outward, letting the harsh, icy winter wind roar into his warm sanctuary. It violently disturbed the dust and extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. But it was not the cold nor the dark that froze his blood. As the window opened, the foundational sound of his life, the constant, protective matrix of ticking that rose from the shop downstairs, simply vanished. It didn't fade. It didn't stutter. It wasn't masked by the wind. It stopped. 1,000 clocks, many with pendulums the size of human torsos, simply ceased their work in the same microsecond. The silence that followed was aggressive, a physical weight that pressed down on the building. In that unnatural quiet, every creak of the old timbers sounded like a gunshot. The only remaining sound was his own rapid, shallow breathing, and the distant howl of the wind. Panic, cold and rational, finally took root. Herr Weber looked back down at the street lamp, ready to yell, to scream, to offer any help. But the woman was gone. The space beneath the light was empty, the snow undisturbed by footprints leading to or from the lamp-post. There was only the swirling, indifferent snow, heart hammering a frantic rhythm in his chest that seemed far too fast for the slow world around him. He forced the window shut against the wind, locking the latch with shaking, useless fingers. He fumbled in the dark for his matches, striking several that sputtered out before finally lighting the kerosene lamp. The flame bloomed, casting dancing, anxious shadows across the room. Reluctantly, driven by a desperate need to find a mechanical explanation, he descended the spiral stairs into the shop, holding the lamp high. The air downstairs was frigid. Every clock, his entire collection, had frozen at exactly 11:34 p.m. The air, usually thick with kinetic energy and the scent of oil and wood, was now dead and stagnant. He checked the main grandfather clock, a massive piece of Austrian engineering, pushing the pendulum back into motion. It swung twice, giving 2 sluggish, dying tocks, before clicking to a halt again, resisting motion as if locked by an internal, powerful force. Herr Weber moved from clock to clock, his dread deepening. Nothing would run. His sanctuary had become a museum of static things. He was alone, isolated by the snow, trapped in an impossible, frozen silence. His eyes scanned the room, looking for anything that might explain it, and they fell upon his main repair workbench, the heart of his operation. That evening, he had left it perfectly clear and swept clean of brass shavings. He knew this as certainly as he knew his own name. But now, resting precisely in the center of the dark oak surface, illuminated by the nervous light of his lamp, was an object that had not been there hours ago. It was a heavy, silver-plated pocket watch. It wasn't Oakhaven style. It looked ancient and maritime, its metal cover tarnished, its chain coiled around it like a silver snake. He had never seen this watch before in his 50 years of collecting. He reached for it, his hand trembling so violently he nearly knocked over his lamp. It was unnervingly heavy, and so cold it burned his fingertips, as if it had spent the last hour not in his workshop, but buried in the snow. With a dry mouth, he found the release button and clicked open the tarnished lid. The watch face itself was unremarkable. The numbers faded. The single hand pointed stubbornly to 11:34, but it was the inside of the lid that made the world lurch sideways. There, freshly, deeply, and crudely engraved, as if with a nail by a desperate hand, were words. He tilted the watch to catch the lantern light, and a cold, primal terror, worse than any silence, washed over him. The words read, "Thank you for opening the window. Herr Weber, I have been waiting for someone to let me listen. Now that the world is quiet, I will come inside tonight to see your collection." Herr Weber closed the watch, the click sounding like the snap of a bone. His mind refused to process the impossibility of it, the time it would take to engrave that, the fact that no one had entered his locked shop, the coincidence of his name. None of it mattered. The logic of his mechanical world had shattered. Panic, feral and absolute, took over. He ran back up the spiral stairs, locking the door behind him and dragging a heavy bookcase across it with strength he didn't know he had. He blew out the lamp, knowing it was futile to hide, and crawled into his bed, pulling the covers over his head like a child. He tried to tell himself it was a hallucination, a dream, the result of bad tea and too much solitude. But the silence downstairs remained, a heavy, oppressive vacuum. He lay there, staring into the darkness, his senses magnified. Every creak of the old timbers above, every shift of the snow on the roof, sounded like an encroachment. He didn't know how much time passed in that silence. Without his clocks, the world had no measurement. He could have been lying there for minutes or for decades. And then it started. It began beneath him. The spiral staircase was the old kind, built from thick oak that had dried and groaned for 2 centuries. It had a very specific voice. Herr Weber knew exactly which step was the quietest, which one cracked like thunder, and which one groaned like a living thing. Now, distinct and clear through the dead air, a sound cut through the vacuum. Creak! A pause. Then a few seconds later, higher up, Gruan! The stairs were speaking. Someone was walking up them. The steps were slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. It was not a fast ascent. It was a movement that savored the silence, emphasizing every noise. Herr Weber was paralyzed, his heart a trapped bird hammering against his ribs, fighting the silent room. He didn't breathe. He only listened, counting the steps. 5 more steps, 3, 1. The steps stopped. He knew with an absolute metaphysical certainty that it was standing directly outside his locked, barricaded door. There was no breathing, no scratching, just the oppressive, terrifying stillness of waiting. The air in his room, even under his covers, turned arctic, freezing the sweat on his skin. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he were dead, wishing he had never been born, wishing for just one single, comforting tick of a pendulum to save him. The silent waiting outside his door lasted for what felt like an eternity. And then another sound began. It was not the door handle turning, nor the sound of wood breaking. It was a soft, thin, agonizing noise. The noise of metal slowly scratching against metal. The scratching was coming from the center of the bookcase. He had pushed against the door. He didn't open his eyes, but he could picture it. The engraving tool from the silver watch below, or perhaps a sharp fingernail, cutting words into the wood. The sound was hypnotic, a tiny, terrible noise that filled his entire universe, louder than any grandfather clock. He could almost make out the words as they were being carved, syllable by painful syllable. Kasi motri rukiha, engskabi instera. He passed out, terror severing his connection to consciousness, his mind shutting down before the scratching could finish. He woke with a gasp, sunlight streaming like golden spears through the cracks in the velvet curtains he had never closed. He was in his own bed, his blankets tangled. The silence was gone. The rhythmic, comforting, foundational tick-tock of 1,000 clocks rose from below like a tidal wave, filling the air, defining the world, proving that everything was okay. He sat up, gasping for air, his body aching as if he'd been beaten. A dream. A terrible, logic-breaking, soul-shattering nightmare. He laughed, a high-panicked, shaking laugh that sounded foreign even to him. He was Herr Weber. He was fine. He got out of bed, feeling the cool wood floor on his bare feet. The shop below was a comfort. The window was still locked. The curtains were open slightly. He pulled them wide, revealing a village of Oakhaven smothered in fresh, clean snow, the world looking peaceful and silent outside, even if his world was loud inside. He descended the spiral stairs. The bookcase was exactly where it belonged, against the back wall holding his books. The shop door was securely locked. The grandfather clock showed 8:32 a.m., its massive pendulum swinging faithfully. The birds in the cuckoo clocks were singing. Everything was as it should be. The nightmare was a symptom of solitude. Then his eyes fell upon his main repair workbench. He walked toward it, ready to begin his day. His heart, which had just calmed, began to race again. He reached his hand out, hoping his eyes were tricking him, hoping the light was bad. Resting precisely in the center of the workbench, its tarnished lid slightly open, was the heavy silver-plated pocket watch. But it wasn't the watch that made his knees buckle, forcing him to grip the edge of the table for support. His eyes drifted from the watch to the workbench surface itself, the dark oak he had always kept so pristine. There, newly, deeply and crudely engraved, as if with a heavy file by a powerful, desperate hand, were words. He leaned in, the light from the front window illuminating the fresh, deep furrows in the wood. Your clocks are delightful, Herr Weber, but I enjoyed the silence more. You gave me such a wonderful listening experience. Every second was precious. I will be sure to return every single night. The moment the ticking stops, I will be back. Do not lock the door. I will always find a way in. We have so many hours to fill. Herr Weber looked up at the massive grandfather clock. Its pendulum was still swinging, a powerful, rhythmic tuck, 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 but now that sound no longer brought comfort. It was no longer a rhythm of life. It was a countdown. He knew with terrifying certainty that he could never again leave this shop. Nor could he let the clocks run down. If even one stopped, the silence would return. And the silence was not empty. It was full of something that waited. As he stood there, a prisoner of time, the grandest and oldest clock in the center of the shop gave a single, final groan, and its massive pendulum began to swing just a fraction of an inch less than it had before. Next, Story 2. Arthur had lived on the jagged, weather-beaten edge of Blackwood Point for 3 long years, serving as the sole night caretaker for the automated lighthouse. The tower rose like a giant, sun-bleached bone from a dramatic shelf of granite off the coast of Maine, surrounded by an icy, treacherous Atlantic that seemed perpetually hungry. The work itself was not physically demanding, which was precisely why Arthur had chosen it after his wife passed away. The quiet was meant to be a balm for a bruised mind. His primary duties involved checking the oil pressure in the secondary, backup generators, ensuring the giant glass Fresnel lens rotated smoothly on its bed of liquid mercury, and recording the sea surface conditions in a thick, leather-bound logbook at the top of every hour. Most nights were defined by a hypnotic, predictable pattern, the slow, mechanical whir-click of the light revolving high above, the heavy hum of the diesel generator in the basement, and the endless, soothing roar of the tide dragging smooth stones back and forth across the narrow, gravelly beach below. It was a rhythmic, lonely existence, but it was an existence with rules. Water rose, water fell. The light burned, the darkness stayed at bay. On a cold, windless Tuesday evening, the weather radio predicted clear skies and calm waters, forecasting a minor low tide around Arthur settled into the keeper's room. Directly beneath the lamp house, a circular chamber clad in whitewashed stone, furnished with a simple wooden desk, a cast-iron stove, and a tall arched window that overlooked the black expanse of the ocean. The air inside smelled of stale black tea, brass polish, and dried lavender. By midnight, the sea had flattened out until it resembled a vast sheet of polished obsidian, reflecting the scattered stars above with terrifying mirror-like clarity. There was no wind to whisper through the iron railings outside, no foghorn groaning in the distance, only the ambient murmur of the ocean gently lapping against the base of the cliff. Arthur pulled his wool sweater tight around his shoulders, taking a slow sip from a chipped ceramic mug, watching the brilliant beam of white light sweep across the dark. Water, a 3-mile streak of gold, cutting through the void. Over and over every 12 seconds. At precisely 2:15 a.m., Arthur paused, his pen hovering just above the cream-colored page of his logbook. He listened closely, his brow furrowing as he set his mug down on the blotter. The low, rhythmic sound of the surf had changed. The wet, slapping noise against the granite rocks was becoming fainter, dropping in volume until it sounded less like a tide and more like water, draining slowly down a very deep pipe. He stood up from his swivel chair, his knees popping in the quiet room, and pressed his face close to the cold, thick glass of the arched window. He cupped his hands around his eyes to block out the warm yellow reflection of the room's oil lamp. Outside, the beam of the lighthouse swept out over the sea, but as the bright ray hit the water near the shore, Arthur noticed something fundamentally wrong with the shoreline. The tide had not merely receded to the standard low-water mark. It was retreating at a speed that defied every law of physics he had ever been taught. Arthur grabbed his heavy flashlight from the wall-charging dock, unbolted the heavy iron door leading to the outdoor gallery walkway, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The cold was absolute and dry, settling over his skin like an icy sheet. He leaned over the painted iron railing and pointed his flashlight down at the base of the cliff, the water was gushing away from the land like a broken dam, pulling back hundreds of yards every few seconds with a deep, wet-sucking noise that vibrated in his teeth. Within 10 minutes, the shallow bay surrounding Blackwood Point had completely emptied, revealing mudflats that hadn't seen the sun in decades. But the water didn't stop there. It continued to drain away with horrifying momentum, roaring off into the deep horizon as if the Atlantic Ocean itself was being siphoned down an invisible, fathomless sinkhole out in the open abyss. Arthur watched in stunned, breathless silence as miles upon miles of the ocean floor were violently unveiled beneath the pale moonlight. Where the sea had been 50 fathoms deep just half an hour ago, there was now only a vast, alien landscape of slick black silt, jagged trenches, sunken ships resting like rotted whale skeletons, and ancient rock formations that looked eerily like forgotten, collapsed architecture. The stench hit him next, carried on a sudden, unnatural draft of cold air that rose from the exposed seabed. It was not the familiar, salty smell of fresh seaweed, but a foul, suffocating odor of ancient decay, crushed shells, rotten mud, and something metallic like copper and spoiled meat. The beam of the lighthouse continued its mechanical rotation, sweeping across this newly exposed wasteland, casting long, frantic shadows over a world that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. Arthur's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped his flashlight over the edge of the railing. He adjusted the spotlight mounted on the gallery deck, manually aiming its powerful beam straight down into the vast, dark plain that had once been the seafloor. He clicked the high beams on, illumination cutting through the blackness for nearly a mile. The light swept over mounds of black coral, submerged canyons, and the rusted, barnacle-encrusted hull of a 19th-century steamship that lay broken on its side. Then, as the light panned further out, past the ship, Arthur froze, his throat tightening until he couldn't swallow. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. Past the sunken ship, sticking up out of the deep black silt, were thousands of strange, tall, organic shapes. At first, his mind frantically tried to label them as kelp stalks, sea vents or basalt pillars carved by ancient currents, but as he dialed the spotlight into sharp focus, the horrific reality crystallized in his mind. They were figures, pale, impossibly thin, and standing over 12 feet tall. Their skin had the slick, glistening texture of wet rubber or dead dolphin hide. They were human-like in shape, yet twisted, their limbs absurdly long and jointed in ways that broke every rule of anatomy, ending in thin, webbing, stretched fingers that dragged through the mud. Thousands of them lay half-buried in the black silt, tangled together like sleeping insects in a hive. And as the seawater drained completely away, leaving them fully exposed to the open, air-filled night, they began to wake up. Arthur watched, paralyzed by a cold, primal terror as one by one, the massive pale forms began to twitch. They raised their featureless oval heads toward the sky, shivering violently, as if reacting to the absence of the water pressure that had held them down for thousands of years. Then, with terrifyingly fluid, silent movements, they began to stand. The plain of the ocean floor became a forest of pale, rising limbs. Thousands upon thousands of tall, glistening creatures hauled themselves out of the deep abyssal mud, their long bodies slick with sea slime. They did not make a single sound. There were no roars, no shrieks, no splashes. The silence was absolute, making their coordinated movement infinitely more terrifying. They stood erect on the exposed seabed, their pale bodies catching the stark white beam of the lighthouse. Then, in unison, as if responding to a silent signal radiating from the dark horizon, the entire vast horde turned their headless, featureless torsos toward the shoreline, toward the lighthouse, and began to walk. They moved with a strange, gliding march, their long, spider-like legs stepping over sunken rocks and shipwrecks, covering ground with frightening speed, advancing out of the deep ocean bed like an army of pale ghosts marching up from hell. Arthur stumbled backward, slamming his back against the cold stone of the lighthouse tower, his flashlight clattering onto the metal grate deck. He screamed, but the sound was choked in his throat, coming out as a wet, pathetic wheeze. He looked out over the railing again. The creatures were not spreading out. They were converging. They were streaming up the newly exposed underwater canyons, their long limbs pulling them up the slippery granite cliffs of Blackwood Point. They moved without urgency, yet their stride was so vast that they covered hundreds of yards in a matter of seconds. Arthur scrambled back through the gallery door, slamming the thick iron hatch shut and dropping the heavy locking bar into place with a loud metallic clang. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, his skin drenched in a cold, greasy sweat. He threw his weight against the iron door, sliding the secondary deadbolts across, his hands slick and clumsy. He ran down the narrow spiral iron staircase, his boots clattering like gunfire against the metal steps. He reached his living quarters, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. He grabbed the emergency radio handset on his desk, his thumb frantically hammering the channel selector to the Coast Guard frequency. He shoved the receiver to his ear and pressed the push-to-talk button. Static filled the line, a high-pitched, warbling screech that sounded less like electrical interference and more like a chorus of microscopic voices, whispering in a language made entirely of clicks and wet pops. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Blackwood Point Light!" Arthur screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with hysteria. "The water is gone. The ocean is completely gone. There are things on the seabed. They're coming up the cliff. I need help. Somebody answer me." He unpressed the button, holding his breath, waiting for a human voice, a captain's calm drawl, anything. There was only the warbling static, pulsing in time with his own frantic heartbeat. He dropped the radio, turning around to face the center of the room. The lighthouse was built of solid granite, 4 feet thick at the base, designed to withstand hurricane-force winds and giant rogue waves. Yet, as he stood in the center of the small room, he felt a deep, low vibration travel up through the floorboards, a heavy, rhythmic shudder that had nothing to do with the wind or the sea. Something was ascending the outer wall of the tower. He heard the sickening, wet sound of cold skin sticking to stone, a slow, crawling slurp-slap that moved up the vertical masonry from the base of the cliff. It moved closer and closer, passing the level of the storehouse, passing his bedroom, approaching the keeper's chamber. Arthur backed away until his spine pressed against the cast-iron stove in the corner, his eyes locked on the heavy, arched wooden door that led down to the ground-level entrance of the lighthouse. The air in the room grew rapidly colder, the glass in the window frosting over from the outside with intricate, jagged ice patterns that blurred the stars. The smell of rotten brine and deep ocean mud began to seep in, through the keyhole and the cracks, around the doorframe, so thick and pungent that Arthur choked, gagging and covering his mouth with the sleeve of his sweater. He stared at the brass door handle, slowly, agonized by every fraction of an inch. The heavy brass lever began to depress downward. Someone or something was testing the latch from the other side. The lock held, but the wooden door creaked under an immense, steady pressure from the outside. Then the door handle stopped moving. The pressure vanished. For a second, a horrible, suffocating silence descended over the room. Arthur held his breath, his eyes wide, his knuckles white as he gripped his knees. Then came the knock. It was not a sharp, angry pound nor a polite rattle. It was a single, heavy, wet thud against the oak wood, sound like a massive piece of waterlogged meat being thrown against the door, so hard the iron hinges groaned in their sockets. It was followed by a long, slow dragging sound, as if whatever stood outside was leaning its vast, slick weight against the frame, resting its head against the wood, listening for the sound of breathing inside. Through the thick oak panels, Arthur heard a faint wet sound, a wet, suction-like noise that sounded like a throat attempting to form human words without a tongue or lungs. It was a gentle, rhythmic sound, echoing the rhythm of the waves that were supposed to be crashing against the rocks outside. It was calling to the sea, or perhaps calling to him to open the door before the ocean returned to fill the void. Outside the window, Arthur caught a brief, terrifying glimpse of a long, pale, webbed hand sliding across the frosty glass, leaving a trail of black glowing sea slime in its wake. The sea was coming back. He could hear it now, a distant, thunderous roar miles out in the dark. A wall of displaced water rushing back to fill the empty ocean bed with catastrophic force. But the thing outside his door was not going back to the deep. It had found the light, and it was waiting for Arthur to let it in, before the dark water claimed the world again.